Good evening and welcome to the first ever Friends of the Solana Beach Library online Friends Night Out. I'm Linnea Dayton, one of the directors at large of the Friends, and also here hosting this Zoom meeting are directors Vicki Driver, past president, and Troy Diano. Hosting, that means somehow magically making it all happen. Tonight, Del Mar author Chuck Weikert will present Coral Reef Curiosities, a wonderful program about the biology and cultural and historical connections of the fascinating creatures that live in, on, and around the coral reefs of the world. But before we start, we'd like to take just a few minutes for some updates. Observing the guidance of the California Health Department and directives of the San Diego County Library System, our Friends of the Library bookstore can't reopen yet. But as of today, at least, our Solana Beach Library itself provides doorside pickup and drop off of books and other materials Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. However, things change often these days, and the best place to check for current information about library hours and services is the county library website, www.sdcl.org. As of today, you can phone the Solana Beach branch or request a particular book through the SDCL website and be notified when it's ready to pick up doorside at the library. Also, there's a table of new and popular books just inside the library door where you can pick out books and a staff member will help you check them out. And if you're looking for a mystery to read, a movie to watch, a bunch of bedtime stories for your 4-year-old, a book on coral reefs, or whatever, staff members are happy to go inside the library and bring back some books or CDs or videos that might fit the bill. Again, the most up-to-date information about library hours and services can be found at the sdcl.org website. Now about tonight's presentation. Chuck Weikert is the author of the book Coral Reef Curiosities. It's right here, and it's getting a little bounce from my light. Ooh, there. Intrigue, Deception, and Wonder on the Reef and Beyond. Living in Del Mar with his wife, Rosemary, and 2 cats, Chuck is retired after a rewarding National Park Service career, during which he spent 13 years as a ranger at Virgin Islands National Park, presenting programs, writing extensively about coral reef ecosystems, and championing the need to protect and preserve them. Chuck will tell you a little bit about his career in his presentation, but I'll quickly give you a little background about the author in his book. Chuck Weikert was born, raised, and educated in northern Delaware, where he lived near a small brook and a wetland known simply as the swamp. He turned over rocks just to see who lived there. He fished, built dams and tree houses, and captured frogs, toads, snakes, and whatever else he could trot home to his terrarium. He raised tropical fish, built an ant farm, and one time he managed to release hundreds of baby praying mantises into the house. At age 10, on a ranger-led tide pool encounter in Acadia National Park, one look at the park ranger was all it took for Chuck to know that what he wanted to be when he grew up. He describes himself as not a particularly dedicated student in his youth. Chuck was more interested in learning how to tie flies, read a stream, swim, and play sports. Somehow I stumbled through college, he says. He emerged with scuba diver certification and a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Delaware, ready to see the world. For 2 years, he was a Peace Corps volunteer teacher in the Kingdom of Tonga, but he'll tell you more about that, I think, in his presentation. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box. You can open it by clicking that little Q&A symbol at the bottom of your screen, and he will answer them at the end of the program. Chuck, take it away.
Wow, thank you, Linnea. That's a very kind introduction. I appreciate it. And good evening, everyone. And it's always a little bit odd doing these kind of presentations, not being able to see my audience. Normally as a ranger or somebody doing a program at any time, you have a group of people sitting in the audience and you can read your audience and get a feel for whether or not they're understanding what you're saying or not. But I can't do that tonight. And I'm talking virtually, obviously, in a program that was originally designed to be done on March 17th. Well, you all know what happened around March 17th. And since then, we've been helping to do this program, and I'm really appreciative to the Friends of the Library for allowing me this time tonight to do this presentation. I also want to thank the library itself. Solana Beach Library was a wonderful place for me to do research by way of providing not only space to work, but also the interlibrary loan. I was able to do phenomenal amounts of research because of that wonderful service that our San Diego County libraries provide. So I want to thank them for doing that. It's a terrific resource that we have here in Solana Beach. I also want to thank Vicki, Troy, and Linnea. They spent what was originally programmed for a 20-minute, let's help Chuck get his program up to speed, that turned into a 2-hour head session on Saturday trying to figure all this out. But they were very kind to share their time with me. And this is my first chance to really publicly thank my editor, my publisher, my book designer, and that is Linnea Dayton, whom you just heard of Dayton Publications. That's her company. I could not have asked for a better editor, book designer, somebody to really get this book off the ground. So she did a terrific job, and I just am so appreciative for that fact. So my program this evening, it's a mix of a little bit of everything. It's a mix of a few stories I've discovered while researching the essays that found their home in this book. We're going to visit coral reefs near and far. We're going to cross time, move back and forth in time, and some of the things that you'll see on the screen will be familiar. Some of them may not be familiar. Some of the stories may be a little bit familiar, but I suspect that many of them will not. But I hope there's a little bit of something here for everyone to cue your interest and spark your own curiosity about this really amazing resource, this planetary natural resource, the coral reef. I'm going to start it off with a question, and you can put your answers in the Q&A box there, and we'll go back to them shortly and as a part of the program. My question is, I'm always curious, what do people think of when they think of a coral reef? Some of you may have been to a reef, some of you may have not. But in just 1 or 2 words, just put in that Q&A box what your impressions are, and we'll visit that shortly. In the meantime, while you're doing that, let's take a little bit of a stroll around the globe to some of the places that have been important in my life. And Linnea mentioned the Peace Corps, and I joined the Peace Corps shortly after college, and I was assigned as a teacher in a place called Tonga. Well, I had no idea where Tonga is, and some of you may not either, but Tonga, and I hope everybody can see my cursor there. Tonga is about 500 miles east of Fiji, north of New Zealand, and it is a place smack dab in the middle of a world of wonder when it comes to coral reefs and their resources. Tonga is located right on the international date line. It is the place where time begins. That's what they call it, because every new day dawns in Tonga first. And just as an aside, when the millennium came, my wife and I found ourselves on a little beach, sort of right there in the Hapai group on a little island called Lifuka. And we were among the first people in the world, just a small group of us there, to see the dawning of January 1st, 2000. It was quite a remarkable experience. So anyway, Tonga is about 150 miles islands scattered across a few hundred miles of ocean. It includes small tropical islets, small with beautiful beaches, volcanic peaks as well. And it was in Tonga where, other than learning how to speak Tongan, a really interesting language itself, I was introduced to what I like to call the language of a coral reef, just hanging out with Tongan people, going fishing with Tongans. I learned how intimate their lives are entwined with the world of the coral reef and the sea. And that's where my interest was really piqued, in just learning as much as I could about tropical coral reefs. The Tongan language, I'm not a linguistic linguistically talented person, but it was a fun language to learn. It's chock full of glottal stops and vowels. And to this day, when I think of a whale, I think of it as not a whale, but tofuwa'a. A moray eel is toke, and the wonderful, bizarre porcupine fish is soke. So that gives you a feel for what that interesting language sounds like. It's a Polynesian dialect. So from there, when I mentioned I got a job with, my dream job was with the National Park Service. I was hired as a ranger, bounced around a few parks in the stateside, and then I got my dream of all dream jobs when I applied for it, was accepted as a ranger at Virgin Islands National Park. And it was there that I got the chance to work with some amazing people who are extremely knowledgeable about coral reefs. And it affected my career enormously so, because I came to appreciate what they were. But some of the fun stuff we did was also lead programs and interpret coral reefs for park visitors during your normal ranger-led programs, as well as guided snorkel trips and that kind of thing. And we had a really fun puppet theater that we engaged people, campers, and local people who lived on St. John and St. Jonians to help them to learn and understand the world of the coral reef. All right, coming back to the present. Now is there a way, Vicki, for you to tell me what some of the answers were to the question about what pops into people's minds when they think of coral reefs?
Sure. Some of the people said a living community, beautiful.
Great.
Beautiful sea life, beyond beautiful and fun.
I like that.
Stunning fan corals. A place of wonder and surprise.
Perfect.
Here's a few more. Beautiful and colorful when healthy.
Excellent answer.
And
okay, great. Well, we got a lot of nice feedback, and that's terrific. And a lot of it is similar to what I feel and what many of the rest of you probably feel when you think of coral reefs. A few things that always pop into my mind, and some people got to that point. Color. Corals are extremely colorful, incredible hues of pink and orange and green and blue. And every time you think you've seen all of the colors there are to see, you turn around and you see another beautiful one. The other thing that pops into my mind are textures. Coral reefs are incredibly textural. This is actually a mangrove area, but it's such a beautiful picture of a sponge and some little corals above it that I couldn't resist using it to illustrate textures. Everything from smooth to rough to lumpy and everything in between. So the coral reefs are textural in nature, and also shapes, incredible shapes and diverse forms that just draw your eye as a snorkeler or a diver, and you can't get enough of them. But what if I told you this? As of about a decade ago, another thing that pops into my mind when I think of coral reefs is the Civil War. Now that's about as far as you can get from a coral reef as you can imagine, but here's the story, and it's what led me into this book, developing and writing this book. It was at the New York Historical Society Museum in Manhattan, in New York City. I stumbled upon an exhibit that was interpreting Robert E. Lee and U.S. Grant and their role they played in the Civil War. And I came upon this, and it was one of those exhibits where if you're in an art museum or in a gallery of some sort, sometimes you come upon something and it just rivets you to the floor, and you just can't get away from it. And you read about its story, and that's what happened to me here. Now, it's a nasty looking thing. It's a knife about 12 inches long, whose history was critical to the Civil War, and it belonged to the abolitionist John Brown. And it was, if you remember your U.S. history, on a wet, chilly night in 1859, Brown led a raid on the armory at Harper's Ferry, what was then West Virginia. He was captured by Lee and hung, and he became, of course, a martyr to the North, who supported all of his causes and donated money to him and were rallying to his cause to abolish slavery. He was, however, a villain to the South. He was hung. He was captured by Southerners. He was hung 2 years later in 1861, and it was one of the sparks for the Civil War. It was a major event, and all I could think of was, I was captivated by the knife and how it was tied in to the United States history in such a way. But what captivated me was, and you'll see it here, that it was the hilt, the handle. And some of you might recognize it as what we call tortoise shell. And all I could think of is how did this knife play such an important role in the United States history? And how was it that this knife came in Brown's possession? And where did that handle come from? They were crafting handles out of tortoise shell back in the 19th century. So I did some research. And as some of you know, and have fallen prey to this, I fell into the rabbit hole of research rapture, where you start out with one thing and you end up an hour later learning about something entirely different. And that's what happened to me. I couldn't get enough of this story. And I learned that tortoise shell was one of the world's earliest trade objects, luxury objects. In fact, it was traded as long ago as the time of the Egyptians. It was traded as long ago as 2,000 years into the interior of North America, as far in as Indiana, present-day Indiana. But most of all, it's used, and you've seen it in many places, hopefully mainly in its artificial form, but you can still see it in museums, for example, like this, to decorate tea caddies, combs, knives, and musical instruments, such as things like mandolins. This is a mandolin from the 19th century, and it shows the inlay work fashioned from tortoise shell. But more than that, tortoise shell was used to design incredible masks and ornaments. This is a beautiful mask that was made by islanders in the Torres Straits, which are just north of Australia, between Australia and New Guinea. And what is fascinating is that tortoise shell is a common link between all sorts of cultures that have viewed it in a different way and used it in different ways to craft articles, whether they're mandolins or knives or masks. And it's all a human attachment to this natural object from the coral reef that really piqued my curiosity. Well, where's the shell from? Where's tortoise shell come from? You probably know it comes from one of the coral reef's most beautiful, incredible animals. This is a hawksbill sea turtle, so named for the shape of its beak. That hawk-like beak is used to scrape sponges from the coral reef. And the shell is what provides the material to fashion these objects of tortoise shell. The hawksbill, along with other sea turtles, is on the endangered species list. They are protected and no longer harvestable. Illegal harvest still goes on, but in the Virgin Islands, at least, there are healthy populations of hawksbills. They seem to be doing quite well down there. Good news there. So the stage is set for my little talk tonight, a long way of setting the stage, but just like Alice in Wonderland, the more I learned about coral reefs and the stories behind them, the curiouser and curiouser they became, to borrow from Lewis Carroll. I discovered wonderful stories that connect science, history, culture to we humans, stories that add a subtext to marine creatures I never would have thought about, that cuts across the different cultures, but in a way unites us as humans to the unusual and fascinating ways that these animals make their living and are viewed and often used by different cultures for inspiration. So let's hop through this mysterious looking glass of wonder, if you will, and let's take a look and see what we can see down there. Does that sound good? Raise your hand. I can't see anybody. Okay, we'll pretend that everybody raised their hands. We're going for a dive now. Here we are, underwater, about to explore one of the liveliest places on planet Earth. We're going to meander around a bit, just as if we were snorkelers or divers. And for those of you that are snorkelers or divers out there, you know the sensory feeling that you get. And even though you might be a part of a group and you're trying to stay with that group, you see something moving over here, you see an interesting object over there, you hear something, the snaps, crackles, and grunts that are on a reef are something that surprises just about everybody that's new to this environment. And it's the closest you can feel to being an astronaut drifting in outer space. It's just pure magic. And speaking of magic, it's appropriate that the first animal that we happen upon is an octopus, this amazing wonder. I don't know if you've ever encountered an octopus at an aquarium. Birch Aquarium has an incredible giant Pacific octopus on display, and hopefully it will be reopening again soon so we can all go down there and see it once again. But if you go eye to eye with an octopus, you can definitely sense that there's something there. They study you as much as you study them. They're very curious, they're very intelligent, and it's just one of the most incredible animals on the coral reef. This particular octopus is Octopus vulgaris. It's the common octopus. And you know, here's Chuck's movie recommendation for the week. We're all getting those as these days go by. This is a documentary. It's called My Octopus Teacher. The star in that documentary is the common octopus, just like the one pictured here. How to find an octopus? Well, they're clever little guys. They find interesting habitats, everything from bottles to cinder blocks to you name it. But usually they're found in little reef crevices tucked away in their dens during the day. Usually don't come out at night. And you can often find them by looking for their trash heaps. If you look around, I hope everybody can see my cursor. If you look around there, you can see those different shells. And what octopuses do, they get a shell, they pry it open and cast the shell out of their den. You'll also find crab carapaces, lobsters, you know, all manner. They have their prey is wide and all sorts of different creatures that they take advantage of. In Tonga, people walk the reef at low tide and jerk them out of their caves with iron rebar, little hooks. But there was another way to catch them. And it was through something very curious and very much odd looking. This is a makafeke. That's the Tongan word for this. This is in Polynesia, and this particular lure is used in different island groups down there. Maka means rock, feke means octopus. And here's the story of the makafeke as I wrote about and as was told to me in Tonga. And it's read by my lovely wife, Rosemary. Rosemary, you're on.
Hello.
There she is.
Okay, this is Why the Octopus Hates the Rat. As the story goes, after its canoe sank, the rat was offered a ride to shore by a passing octopus. The rat happily jumped atop the octopus's head, was shuttled to a nearby island, and after hopping to safety, shouted, "Thanks, octopus. I left you a little present on your head." With an arm, the octopus reached up and discovered that the rat had left a pile of excrement up there. Since then, whenever an octopus spots a rat, it goes into a rage. Knowing this, Pacific Islanders construct a rat-like stone and leopard cowrie shell lure, then dangle it over the octopus's lair. Spotting its old nemesis, the rat, the octopus rushes forth and seizes the lure, only to be drawn to the surface by the fishermen.
Thank you, Rosemary. Great reading, and appreciate it. I've got 3 readers tonight. Rosemary is 1, and I've got 2 more yet to come. But Rosemary, thank you very much. Appreciate it. And you can research the makafeke and the octopus lure and that story I talked about on the internet, and you can actually find videos of the thing being used. It's a pretty interesting thing to see an octopus grabbing that weird lure. All right, so it's time to pause a little bit because we haven't talked about one very, very important thing when it comes to the coral reefs. What exactly is a coral? Is it a rock? Is it a plant? Is it an animal? Well, actually, it's a little bit of each of these. There's nothing quite like it on land. And for most people, they're truly an alien thing, which is one more reason why it's so much fun to see them. Collectively, corals are the architects of the reef that build complex physical frameworks that are built over time by the laying down in a process called calcification of calcium carbonate. Millimeter by millimeter, this essentially limestone is layered down over vast spans of time. It forms the foundation for the incredible things that we call coral reefs today. The coral reef supports over 1 million species of animals, only of which 10% are known today. So it's an incredible resource, and that's why it's being studied extensively even through today. So Corals such as the yellow cup coral on the left are distant cousins of jellyfish, such as this lovely upside down jellyfish, otherwise called a Cassiopeia, and the giant Caribbean anemone are cousins of corals. They'll have one thing in common: they capture microscopic animals, zooplankton, from the surrounding water column by stinging that prey with their tentacles. And now for our brief but biologically spectacular lesson for the day. How do corals actually function? There's the tentacles up there, but coral is actually a mainly stomach with a mouth, and the mouth is surrounded by the tentacles, but it has this amazing symbiotic relationship with a single cell algae called zooxanthellae. And you can see it right there in that little drawing. Sorry about that. And the polyp is assisted, or the symbiosis between the zooxanthellae and the polyp is because the zooxanthellae are literally solar powered factories for the coral polyp. There's photosynthesizing, gaining energy from the sun and converting it into nutrients and of course oxygen for the coral polyp. What does the zooxanthellae get in return? These little single cell algae gets protection, obviously, and they get carbon dioxide from the respiratory process of the polyp, as well as nutrients as well. So it's all working very, very beautifully, and it's an elegant biological phenomenon, these things. Polyps are basically translucent. It's the algae that gives corals their color. If the algae are absent, then you have a very translucent coral, and you can see through to the skeleton of the actual the coral foundation. And I think you might know what I'm getting to. Everything's going along swimmingly until the surrounding water column gets a little too warm in the mid 80s to upper 80s for extensive period of times. The first thing corals do is they expel the zooxanthellae when they get stressed, and they become like this. A bleached coral is not a pretty sight to see. Now, corals can reabsorb the zooxanthellae if the surrounding water cools down sufficiently so and soon enough. But that's the big problem, where the coral reefs are exposed more and more to these marine heat waves that are killing coral reefs. And that's what you read about. We'll talk about that a little bit more here. But when healthy and vibrant corals are a true joy to see, everything from single solitary polyps to plates, to things look like little flower cups and pillars that look like beautiful organ pipes. In the Caribbean, the main reef building corals are things like staghorn coral and elkhorn coral, which provide wonderful refuge for things like snappers and grunts and lobsters and crabs that get back in under those areas, as well as octopuses. And then there's also the incredibly beautiful, to me, these are my favorites, the large boulder corals, the brain corals that are hundreds of years old. These particular brain corals were photographed off Buck Island, and it's right offshore in St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. So calcification is the process by which reefs are built, but we know that because of what science has learned over the years. Now, going back, far back in history, the Greeks had their own ideas about the formation of reefs. And I'm going to show you an image next, but you might not want to look at it too long because it's this gal. Uh-oh, it's Medusa. Now, what could Medusa, on a particularly bad hair day with those snakes in her, surrounding her scalp, what does she possibly have to do with coral reefs and the foundation of coral reefs? Well, the story is told through a very wonderful painting that was done by Claude Lorrain. He was the artist that painted this in 1674. It's called Coast View with Perseus and the Origin of Coral. The Greeks tell this wonderful story about how Perseus came to slay Medusa. You probably remember this from movies as a kid or stories in literature. Perseus did not turn to stone when looking at Medusa. He looked at her image in the reflection of his shield and he beheaded her. He lopped her head off. So here we are at a beach, and out of Medusa, just in case you're wondering, there's Pegasus, the horse that sprung from the body of Medusa. And over here are these curious little images. These are sea nymphs. These are sea nymphs that are joyous because Medusa has been killed. They're dancing around her head there. And then one of them, the way that the myth goes, had a brilliant idea to spirit the head down and into the ocean, where it worked its magic in a positive way now by turning rocks and plants into the world's first corals, and thus became coral reefs. So it's a fascinating little tale, and I always like to tell it and show people those pictures. Now we're going to jump well ahead in time to the early 19th century to a navigator that most of us have probably never heard of, but if you're an Australian or you've been to Australia, you see this guy's name, Flinders, in a lot of places. There's Flinders schools, there's streets, there's riverways named after Flinders. And that's his little kitty cat, Trim, which was his faithful companion. Flinders was a navigator. He was English. He was the first to circumnavigate Australia and show that it was indeed its own continent, its own island. Now, he was on a ship called the Investigator, and the Investigator was a remarkable vessel because it was shallow. It had virtually no draft. It was very shallow draft, flat bottom. He could get really close into coral reefs. So keep in mind, people at that time were still wrestling with what to make of coral reefs and how they were formed. Charles Darwin didn't come on the scene until 1836 and explain them a little bit further. But Flinders was curious. He was like, what are these things? So he puts his boat into shallow water and gets down. He goes for a little, what the Australians called a walkabout. And he walks around and he writes this in his journal. And I find it fascinating because it's still how people tend to describe reefs today. Here's what he wrote. He wrote there were wheat sheaves, things that looked like mushrooms, stag's horns, cabbage leaves, and a variety of other forms equaling in beauty and excelling in grandeur the most favorite parterre of the curious florist. So Flinders compared corals to flowers. It's something that's still done today, but what in the world do you compare these little guys to? This was a really enjoyable part of the book that I like to research. These guys look like frogs. They kind of look like fish. They're actually called frogfish. One of the most bizarre animals on the coral reef. There's about 50 species, and they are interesting because they literally on their pectoral fins can walk ungainly so on the seabed. They can also jet propel themselves short distances from here to there, but they are incredibly talented carnivores. They have a little worm that they dangle from their foreheads that draw other fish in, and with a lightning quick speed, they grab the fish, and that's how they get their food. One of the most interesting frogfish to me is this guy. This is the sargassum frogfish. Now, they're not very common, and they're generally found drifting about in sargassum seaweed. Very difficult to spot. This is the little frogfish. And my friend in the Virgin Islands, Caroline Rogers, took these amazing pictures of these frogfish, not very commonly seen close to islands, but she came upon them one day, took these photographs, and they're just lovely images of the frogfish. And when I started reading about the frogfish and researching it, I came across a curious man by the name of Samuel Fallours. So it was the early 18th century. Fallours was a Dutch soldier, and many of them were posted by the Dutch East India Company at the time to Asia. And he ended up in Indonesia in 1718, and he was a pretty good illustrator. And in his spare time, he would get tropical fish and all sorts of things and illustrate them, and he was illustrating them to sell to wealthy people who would collect them. So he thought they would sell better if he decorated them with things like suns and moons and stars. His lobster is climbing up in trees. And this book became one of the, I think it's called the very first guidebook to tropical fishes in the entire world. It's a wonderful volume. It's put out by, of course, Taschen, who does these great picture books. If you ever have a chance to take a look at it, take a look at it. It's just a fascinating volume. But in the pages of that guidebook is, you guessed it, our friend the frogfish. And this is Fallours' rendition of a frogfish. He called it a sambia, or the walking fish of Amban. And he tells us why with a florid description that goes something like this. I caught it on the sand, he said, and kept it alive for 3 days. It followed me everywhere with great familiarity, much like a little dog. I just love that, much like a little dog. Another fish that Fallours illustrated, and that is one of my all-time favorites, is the moray eel. This is a spotted moray next to a Nassau grouper in the Caribbean. In researching morays, I came across a peculiar relationship that some eels have with groupers. Now, some groupers back up a little bit. Groupers and of course eels are carnivores. And anytime a carnivore can gain an advantage over its competitors, it's going to exploit that advantage. So certain fish tend to follow stingrays because stingrays stir up the bottom and they can grab fish that are stirred up. You'll see fish following octopuses oftentimes. When octopuses are out on the hunt, fish will follow them, hoping to get something that gets stirred up and comes out into the open water. You usually think of fish as singular entities, so you don't really think of them working in a cooperative nature, but apparently sometimes the grouper will go up to a moray eel's lair. Morays are in the crevices in the reef, and it'll shake its head back and forth as if to say, you know, I'm kind of hungry, let's go hunting. Now, I'm anthropomorphizing the whole thing, but that's occasionally what happens. And so off they go on this interesting little hunting expedition. Groupers, not just the Nassau, but others as well. And I have a really kind of a fun video that shows this. You have to watch it carefully because you'll see the moray apparently get some fish. It's going into the crevices where the grouper cannot go. The grouper kind of hangs outside, and towards the end of the video, the grouper lightning fast gets its prey because it's been scared out by the moray. So here we go. Let's see. Ooh, getting long. Oops. Apologies for that. I missed the last second of the video, but so that's a wonderful little video. I love to show it to people. It's just an interesting relationship that the groupers have with the morays. But staying with morays, I can't leave them because I'm fascinated by them. We're off to Polynesia now. Polynesian cultures are a goldmine of fascinating stories that tie into the reef and its creatures. There's myths that interpret sharks, sea turtles, and yes, even moray eels. And one of my favorites, which will be read by Nancy, tells a story of a relationship between a moray eel and the young woman, Hina. So Nancy, can you read that for us now?
I would be delighted to, Chuck.
Great.
Polynesian societies trace the origin of the coconut tree to the relationship between the female deity Hina and a spirit in the form of the moray eel. Hina raised the eel until it became so large that she was forced to release it into the wild. But the eel, smitten by now with its caretaker, bit Hina and followed her wherever she went. Fearful that the eel had become a threatening and cruel deity, villagers fed it a toxic potion that it greedily imbibed. Realizing this mistake, the eel called to Hina, "Since I am dying, let us part in peace. When you hear that they have cooked me, ask the head as your share. Take it and bury it, then look well after the plant that grows there. After 3 years, you will see its bunched fruit. In the nuts, you will see my eyes and mouth, and so we shall still be able to look at each other face to face. Pierce the largest of the 3 eyes, drink the liquid, and eat of the flesh of the fruit, as it is good. The name of the plant will be coconut. All of its parts will be useful. The leaves will be a shade for you, and you will be able to plait them into mats and fans."
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nancy. Nancy's our second reader of the night and very kind to offer to do that. But it's a fun story. It's an elegant little story. It's probably my favorite myth out of Polynesia. about the creatures of the sea. All right, we're going to take a wide U-turn and move from eels to snails. Snails without shells, that is. These are nudibranchs, some of the most beautiful invertebrates on the coral reef. They're generally very, very small. The Spanish dancer on the right side of that image, though, can grow up to be about 25, 26 inches in length. They're incredible animals. I've only seen one once. They're just lovely, lovely. But even offshore here in Southern California, you can find nudibranchs, and divers go down. They're usually very, very tiny, and get some amazing photographs of them. They're related to sea hares, and sea hares this time of year, when we get these big storms at sea that roll kelp into our shores, if you go around and look at some of the kelp at low tide that's washed ashore, you can sometimes find sea hares, which are related to nudibranchs. Strangely enough, there's a connection between nudibranchs and this guy. On the left is, of course, Napoleon Bonaparte. And Napoleon had a thirst not just to conquer and add to the lands of France, to conquer civilizations, but he also had an interest in science. And he would send scientists out on his expeditions. And one very large expedition called the Expedition d'Egypte was in 1798. And off went 167 scientists as a part of this expedition, one of which was this guy in the upper right. That's Jules César Salvigny. And Salvigny had a keen interest in marine animals. He collected them, and he had them illustrated and done up as plates that became an incredible reference book to the sea life in the Red Sea. And what we have here is one of the very first illustrations known of a nudibranch. So people like Napoleon and Salvigny understood the importance of seeing coral reef animals and identifying what they were, the importance of finding out what was on the reefs, and hundreds of other scientists besides Salvigny. We owe them a debt of gratitude for explaining coral reefs and monitoring them. And it's something that is still going on today. Scientists, dedicated people are still out there on coral reefs, sometimes after horrific hurricanes roll through island groups and demolish coral reefs. They go out and check the damage. People are monitoring coral reefs worldwide to see how well they're doing during these times of warming temperatures and bleaching and disease. But it's important data, and it's happening everywhere. As you are aware, the news over recent decades is not all that great. There are invasions of fish that are not native to a certain area. Now, if you see these fish, these are lionfish. If you see them in the Pacific, they're glorious. They're great fun to see. They're beautiful animals, but now they're being seen as about the last, since the 1980s or early 90s, when they were accidentally released into the Atlantic. And they are voracious predators. They breed prolifically. And you can go to the Bahamas, you can go to the Virgin Islands, you can go to all sorts of places, and you see these guys. And they're not a healthy animal to have on coral reefs in the Caribbean. And there's all sorts of programs trying to reduce and eradicate their populations. It's a challenging one. But really, lionfish aside, climate change is the biggest challenge of all. Bleaching of corals is a problem. We also have coral diseases such as white plague, and more recently, stony coral tissue loss disease, which is causing an enormous amount of die-off in the Caribbean. And it's very fast acting. This is a healthy coral, a brain coral. It was May of last year, I believe. And this is what the same coral looked like 9 months later. Hurricanes are happening with more increasing frequency, and they're stronger. In 2017, Hurricanes Irma and Maria pounded my former island, the island of St. John. And this was a pillar coral, a beautiful pillar coral before those storms. And this is what it looked like afterwards. But for every bit of bad news about coral reefs, and this is happening more and more, you can learn about activities and programs that are going on that are rays of hope out there. Researchers are trying to understand what corals, for example, seem to be resistant to higher than normal temperatures. They're finding them in various areas like the Great Barrier Reef. There are some corals that seem to do quite well in mangroves where the temperatures are abnormally high, well into the 80s for lengthy periods of time, and they're doing quite well there. So the thinking is that where corals appear to do well and have the genetic composition, they can be cloned and then seeded onto reefs after growing up to a certain size. You can hear about these programs going on worldwide. There's one very interesting one going on in Australia as we speak. But this is just one of several strategies being tested around the world to restore coral reefs. And there is one big ray of hope that I like to talk about, and that's education. And that's education and hands-on activities that help us all to understand the problems that are happening out there and what we can do to help conserve coral reefs, but especially with children, to help connect them to this very valuable natural resource. And I really think there's a thread that runs through Pacific Islanders who are grappling, telling stories about octopuses and eels and sea turtles. It runs through ancient civilizations trying to understand what coral reefs were and how they formed. It's a thread that connects us to science and to those who understand what's happening on reefs and are trying to conserve these incredible places that biodiversity. But most important, it's a thread that reaches through all of these entities and runs through a little girl's fingertips as she apprehends the magical feel of something called a chocolate chip sea star at the bottom of a touch tank, an experience that very well might change her life forever. And that sea star is a perfect segue to our last story of the day, and that's going to be read to us by Linnea. Linnea, are you ready?
Yes.
You're on.
In more than one version of a story adapted from Lauren Isley's 1969 essay, The Star Thrower, a man comes across a child throwing marooned sea stars back into the sea. Strong waves have pitched them onto the beach, high above the line of drift seaweed, where they will surely die. Child, he says, do you not realize that there are miles and miles of beach, and there are starfish all along every mile? What you're doing can't possibly make a difference. The child launches yet another sea star beyond the surf and replies as it splashes into the water, it made a difference to that one.
Thank you, Linnea. Great little story. So the little star thrower didn't get discouraged. Neither should we. There's things happening that are on an upbeat note. And I have a final note in that regard. My friend, I mentioned her earlier, Dr. Rogers, Caroline Rogers, she's a coral reef ecologist on St. John. She's been down there close to 4 decades now and has seen it all, from the damage done by hurricanes, the damage done by coral diseases, bleaching. She is working very, very hard to understand what's happening in this dynamic world. And I had asked her one time, not too very long ago, I said, Caroline, do you ever get discouraged about what's happening on coral reefs? And her words to me were inspirational. And she said, despite all the problems reefs are having, there's still plenty to see, plenty to be inspired by, and lots to be excited about. So with that in mind, let's go on a virtual snorkel now. And I'm going to take you to a place I was fortunate enough to see at the start of this year, back in January. And it's an example of what is out there and what the future could be if we just take care of these wonderful resources. So I'm going to cue it up and we're going to go for a little virtual snorkel. Ready? Go. the Tongans would say Mavo Alpito, or thank you very much. I really enjoyed doing this program, and yeah, we'll do it again sometime or something similar. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Now I think Vicki has some time for some people to ask questions through the Q&A.
Yeah, Chuck, one of the first questions is, where can somebody buy your book?
You can get it. Linnea, why don't you answer that? What's the best answer for that?
Okay. Sure. Let's see. I wrote an answer in here. Let me see. Sorry, it's okay. Well, normally in a program like this, it would be in the Cove at Earl Warren Middle School, and we would have a table at the back of the auditorium where you could talk with the author after the presentation and buy a book if you'd like, and he would sign it, but not tonight. The book is available in hardcover and paperback through the websites of most independent bookstores, such as Diesel Bookstore in Del Mar, Warwick's in La Jolla, Barnes & Noble in Encinitas, and it's also available, of course, from Amazon.com, where you can also find the Kindle ebook edition of the book. So just about anywhere. If you do it through online, some bookstores may not have it in the brick and mortar store, but they can get it for you if you order it through them. Supports the independent bookstores too.
Thanks, Linnea.
Next question is from Marcia McGee, and she asks, in your opinion, what is the most beautiful coral reef that you have visited?
Oh gosh, I don't think I mentioned with this last little slideshow, but it was probably there, and that was Raja Ampat. Raja Ampat is it's a difficult place to get to, but it's well worth the time to get there. It's in the eastern part of the Indonesian island group. There's two ways to get there. You can go to Australia and take a cruise up into that area. You can go through New Guinea as well and get down there. But it as you saw from these slides, that was probably the most beautiful area. But I always like as that answer that Caroline gave, wherever you go snorkeling at any given time, that's the best place to snorkel on that particular occasion. You never know what you're going to see on a coral reef snorkel trip. There could be, yes, there could be damage to the reef, and that's kind of unpleasant, but you never know when a manta ray might swoop by or an octopus will come out of its lair. It's just some of these wonderful experiences are still to be had in these magical places. But yeah, the Pacific, the South Pacific reefs are still in some places very healthy. You just have to do a little bit of research and find out how different reefs are doing. But Raja Ampat, you can get there someday. That's on my list of best places to go.
All right. Nancy Nigas made a couple of comments. She says, I held an octopus on my arm in Hawaii. I also played hide and seek with an octopus in Baja, Gulfside, for about half an hour.
Wow. What a great experience. Well, if you haven't already seen it, definitely see that documentary, My Octopus Teacher, because some of those same kind of experiences are to be had in that very movie. Lucky you.
And Scott Hansen commented, glad there is hope for the coral. And then Hobie asks, are there many cold water corals? If so, are they colorful too?
Yes, there are. And I have a good friend who's he's with the National Geographic, and he's the chief scientist with an outfit called the Pristine Seas Organization. He sent me a movie recently that was taken, a video that National Geographic put out. It might be available on YouTube by now. And they were divers that were looking at corals and various organisms in the Antarctic, of all places. So there are corals in places like that. Hard to find. There's not as much diversity of corals. Of course, the most diverse corals are in the Pacific, but you can still find coral reefs in cold water areas, but they're unique. They function a little bit differently from tropical coral reefs. I am not a coral reef specialist, so I can't answer that any more specific than to say, yes, they're out there.
Hobie also asked, what animals have you had follow you when you were in the water?
Barracuda. Barracuda are very, very curious. They're unnerving, they're territorial, and that's why they kind of follow you to see where you're going to go next. They don't attack you unless you're wearing some flashy item like a ring or a watch, or sometimes they'll go after that thinking it's a wounded fish. I've had sharks follow me, but they're also more curious than anything. I know octopuses at times will follow people. It's very rare, but sometimes they're just curious and they want to see what's happening. So yeah, it's you just never know what's going to come up out of nowhere and show an interest in you as a diver or snorkeler.
So Heidi asks, where were the pictures from in the virtual snorkel? She thought she saw both animals from Pacific and the Caribbean.
There was Raja Ampat was there. I'd be curious which animals she thought were from the Caribbean. I wonder if an image slipped in there from that shouldn't have been in there. I'll have to go back and look, but the vast majority of them, unfortunately, were not shot by me. I am not an underwater photographer. I gave it my best shot, and it's not my thing, but they were taken by people who were on that expedition that I was on when we went to Raja Ampat. But there might have
All
been.
right.
Yeah, okay.
Scott asks, where in Mexico is the best snorkeling?
Oof. I don't know the Mexican waters that well. I've gone to Cozumel and snorkeled there. I've snorkeled off of a place called Akumal and done diving in both places. I haven't been to Cozumel in an awfully long time, so I can't speak to what kind of condition those reefs are in now, but that's literally not much experience there.
And along those lines, Steve Smith asks, as a local to Del Mar, where do you recommend for local snorkeling and diving?
Oh gosh, I'm not a cold water guy. I've done some snorkeling here, but no diving as yet. I know people go off of La Jolla quite a bit. La Jolla Cove is a popular spot for snorkeling. I don't know if any of my panelists can answer that or not. I long ago swore off cold water diving. I'm just not very comfortable getting suited up and going into that cold water. I get cold very fast.
Okay, another question from Hobie. What man-made treasures have you found while diving and snorkeling?
My goodness, man-made treasures. I don't know how to answer that. Man-made treasures. I've certainly seen wrecks down there in the Virgin Islands and the British Virgin Islands. I've seen wrecks while diving. I wouldn't call that a man-made treasure by any means, but they're treasures if you consider the biodiversity that eventually ends up inhabiting wrecks. There's usually a bunch of big groupers that love to hang out at wrecks. And talking about things that sort of follow you around, big groupers will also do that. If they're used to seeing a lot of divers, they'll unfortunately get used to thinking that people give them handouts and they'll follow you around. But can't think of any other man-made things other than places you'd see on a wreck dive.
Okay, just a couple more questions here. Did you ever have a life-threatening experience while viewing the reefs?
I did one time in Tonga, and it was because of a foolish mistake I made going out to an area where once the tide turned, it funneled water at a very fast rate out through a channel, and that was the only way to get back to the inside of the reef. It was outside the reef, and I tried to get back in. The current had switched, and it was pretty difficult to get back in. That was, I was with one other guy. You should never snorkel or dive without a buddy, but neither one of us could help the other. It was just a matter of swimming as hard as we could and hoping for a wave that would kick us in, which eventually, after a number of minutes of exhausting swimming, that happened. But no, I've been lucky. I've never had emergencies while diving. I'm a very conservative diver and don't push limits depth-wise or lengthwise. So yeah, that's about the only thing I can think of.
All right. Gage asks, as the climate changes, are there areas where coral reefs are naturally moving into new locations?
Oh gosh, Gage, I'm not the one to answer that. I don't want to guess at that. I think corals are beginning probably to establish themselves in places that they weren't normally found, but I don't want to guess to that. That would be something you could get online and start doing some digging on. So I'm sorry, I can't help you with that.
And I guess here from Heidi, she's commenting, the last picture of the flamingo tongue cowrie is from the Caribbean, she thinks.
Yeah.
And then she also says the Birch Aquarium used to take people snorkeling in La Jolla Cave area, which was nice. Also, the outer side of Mariner's Basin as you enter Mission Bay. And she used to work there.
Oh, good. Yeah, while we're on the subject of La Jolla Cove and Birch Aquarium, Birch does still lead the leopard shark snorkels there. When things return to normal, I'm sure they'll do that because the leopard sharks come in very, very close. The females do when they pup, and that's one of the most popular activities you can do with Birch in water. They're very popular. You sign up for them and go out. So yeah, I can promote that. It's great fun. And you're absolutely right. That sea fan and that cowrie was shot in the Caribbean. I did not mean that to come on the heels of that program, imply that it was a part of that. You're right. That little guy, that flamingo tongue, is found in the Caribbean only, not in the Pacific.
And the last comment here says, from Steve Smith, as one UD grad to another, thanks for an informative and enlightening presentation. So thank you, Zach. We really appreciate you.
Yay, good, good. Go Hens. Good, thank you. Nice to know another blue hens out there around here.
All right, so I guess that does it for our talk tonight. Linnea?
No, just was checking in. Sorry.
Well, thank you all. This was our first Friends Night Out online, and if you enjoyed it, please let us know, and we will try to do more adventures like this. We're trying to find out what we can do for the community through the library during this horrific COVID time. So let us know. Thank you all for showing up.
Thank you.